You know something I get kind of nostalgic for sometimes? I get nostalgic for my teenage years where all I read was like a handful of authors. And you know what they didn't do? They didn't put out book one of a trilogy or book one of a planned 9 book series. It was just hit after hit after hit of standalone stories, but they didn't mean that they weren't amazing. And so, what I want to talk to you guys about today is what made Michael Crichton such a special part of my life as a teenager growing up in the 1990s. Let's take a look at Michael Crichton. Personally, I don't deal much in theory. I have to deal with the facts. And on the basis of facts, I don't see much difference in the behavior of men and women. All human behavior has a reason, and all behavior is solving a problem. Power is neither male nor female. Harassment is about power, the undue exercise of power by a superior over a subordinate. The system didn't screw you, the system revealed you. Do you know what we call opinion in the absence of evidence? We call it prejudice. All your life, people will tell you things, and most of the time, probably 95% of the time, what they tell you will be wrong. Nobody dares to solve the problems because the solution might contradict your philosophy, and for most people, clinging to beliefs is more important than succeeding in the world. In the information society, nobody thinks. We expected to banish paper, but we actually banished thought. It is often said that if you didn't know history, you didn't know anything. You were a leaf that didn't know it was part of a tree. In other centuries, human beings wanted to be saved, or improved, or freed, or educated. But in our century, they wanted to be entertained. The great fear is not of disease or death, but of boredom. A sense of time on our hands, a sense of nothing to do, a sense that we are not amused. The planet has survived everything in its time, and it will certainly survive us. The rock, for its part, is not even aware of our existence because we are alive only for a brief instant of its lifespan. To it, we are like flashes in the dark. Let's be clear. The planet is not in jeopardy. We are in jeopardy. We haven't got the power to destroy the planet or to save it, but we might have the power to save ourselves. The purpose of life is to stay alive. Watch any animal in nature. All it does is try to stay alive. It doesn't care about beliefs or philosophy. Whenever any animal's behavior puts it out of touch with the realities of its existence, it becomes extinct. Life breaks free. Life expands to new territories. Painfully, perhaps even dangerously, but life finds a way. John Michael Crichton was born in 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, and earned a Doctor of Medicine degree from Harvard before teaching at Cambridge and MIT. While still a medical student, he published The Andromeda Strain and continued to release New York Times bestsellers such as Jurassic Park, Timeline, Congo, Disclosure, Sphere, and many, many more until his unexpected death in 2008. But why should you read from the Emmy, Peabody, and Writers Guild of America winner Michael Crichton? Well, let's talk about it. Hey, what's up, bookworms and Crichton fans, or maybe potential Crichton fans? We're going to find out if I can do my job and tell you why you should read Michael Crichton in this special. But before we get going, guys, I want to tell you that what I do with my Why You Should Read is it's a non-spoiler kind of thing where I tell you why I really liked an author, why they were important to me, and why I think maybe you should check them out. When it comes to Michael Crichton, there was no author in the 90s besides maybe Stephen King that was more automatic to me. The day one release that they came out with, I was getting it and I was reading. I think Anne Rice was probably the other one. I was never into Grisham or anything like that, but when it was Crichton or King or Anne Rice in the 90s, man, that was it for me. This was before I was into all the crazy series you see behind me and stuff. So it was just a different time. And before I get into why you should read, I want to tell you really why I decided to start reading Michael Crichton. And I think it was kind of like everybody when they first found out about Jurassic Park. It started, but actually it kind of started earlier than that. When I was a preteen, I looked up to my brother. He was 6 years older than me. And anything that he'd read in fantasy, I usually checked out. But after I had tapped out all of his fantasy books, and I wasn't interested in the Hardy Boys or nothing, so I was like, well, what else has he got over here? And I saw The Andromeda Strain. And that was the first science fiction book that I ever read in my life. But I didn't think about Crichton again until, gosh, it was probably right before the Jurassic Park movie came out. And I remember going to a bookstore. At the time, I was looking for more fantasy stuff. And I just saw the pictures of the T-Rex everywhere. Obviously, if you're a boy growing up and you get to all the way up to about your time you're a teenager, you're obsessed with dinosaurs, right? So that got my attention, but I didn't read it. But this is a lot like my Stephen King story, where there was a gateway, and then I went and I absorbed everything they'd done. When after Jurassic Park the movie came out, I did like everyone else, just about go and pick up the book, and I devoured it. And then I did just like I did with my King. I went to my high school library and found that they had everything that the guy had written before that book. And over that summer, or that really the freshman year of high school, I think I read The Terminal Man, Great Train Robbery, Eaters of the Dead, Congo, Sphere, and Rising Sun after I read Jurassic Park, and that got me kind of current with his stuff, and I just ate it up. I could not get enough of it, and then it was started with Disclosure in 1994. That was the day that I became a Crichton reader until the day that he sadly did die. But I want to say that I think a reason that so many people should read Michael Crichton is the man influenced our pop culture in ways that only Stephen King had up to that point. He wrote 28 books. Most of them were bestseller, New York Times bestsellers, top 10, top 5, numerous number ones, 200 million copies sold worldwide, and over a dozen have been adapted to films. I think besides Stephen King, he probably has the most really bad movie adaptations of his amazing works or whatnot. But in TV and film, I mean, he wrote and created Westworld, the movie, which you now see the TV series on HBO. He wrote Twister, and he wrote and created and sometimes directed and did the show running duties on ER for like 15 years. So he directed 7 movies total. So this guy pretty much did a little bit of everything. He won numerous awards, including a Peabody, an Emmy, got recognition from the Writers Guild of America. The guy was just good. Just about everything that he touched turned to gold there for a while, and especially in the 90s. And a little neat little fact that I found while I was actually doing research was, I didn't know this, was that in 1995 he achieved pretty much like the most amazing pop cultural moment that anyone had ever seen. He had at the same time he had the #1 book, the #1 movie, and the #1 TV show in America with Lost World, Congo, and ER all at the same time. And if that wasn't enough, he did it again in 1996 with Airframe, Twister, and ER again. So I mean, no one has topped that. Not even Stephen King, not John Grisham, not J.K. Rowling. No one had done anything like that. So this guy was so far ahead of his competition at the time. He could not be stopped. And long story short, there wasn't much that Michael Crichton wasn't great at. Many people consider him a true Renaissance man. He was everything he did, he was better than everyone else at. I think the term is polymath. And if you haven't read him, I think I want to talk about most of the books. I kind of want to just touch on each book and talk about why I think you would like it or what I liked about it. And I think maybe you'll find something that you like about him, something that you'll find in there, because I think that there truly is something for everyone. I say that he wasn't bound to any genre, but he kind of created his own subgenre known as the techno thriller. I believe that's what, even though there's several of his books that I wouldn't fall in that category, but that's what makes people classify him as, or they put him in science fiction because he always had some kind of take or some kind of prediction about what was coming in the future. And a lot of times he got it right. That's what's really amazing about it. But even when it seems straightforward in current day settings, he tried to always, like I said, make some kind of bold statement or something that he thought that we were heading towards. Like, for example, in Disclosure, very forward thinking, he basically predicted the e-reader and virtual databases. And this guy he had a grip on things. And I think it's because, he had a PhD from Harvard in medicine and stuff like that. So the guy was very, very intelligent. But he never shied away from his feelings on a political landscape or how the media controls people through fear and things like that. And while some of his ideas might have seemed far-fetched at the time, like I said, they were all based in science, and a lot of them have made you think, wow, he was really ahead of the curve on that. So while you hear me a lot of times say, I don't like it when people put modern-day politics into their writing, I think Crichton did it in a way that was like suggesting what he thought we were heading towards more than, hey, this is my opinion, this is why it's right, and I'm going to talk about the president now. That's not exactly what he did. He had his problems with crony capitalism. He had his problem with just the corporate world and how things were run. He had a big problem with the way that the media ran like I said, ran fear through us to control us. And a lot of that stuff is very, very eye-opening when you think about it today, some of the things that he said. But he wasn't cynical, He acknowledged the perils of mankind brought through in science and, technological advances, meddling in things that we shouldn't be meddling with yet, that we don't understand. But all of his works, I think, it has somewhat a skeptical view on humanity. Pretty much their overall importance to our planet. He believed we were going to stop thinking for ourselves. And if you read social media for 5 minutes, I'd say you can see that he may not have been wrong, because everything is just a big echo chamber now. And if you disagree with me, you are evil, is kind of what he said. But he saw these things. He saw these things before. And I'm not saying he was the only person who saw those things, but he was like the first one who kind of popularized some of these thoughts, at least in my life. So let me talk briefly about the books of his that I've read and give you an idea of one or a dozen that you might be looking for, because there's something here for everyone. I know this is a little different format than my usual Why You Should Read, but there's just so much to talk about that if I don't just kind of do it this way, I'm going to talk for an hour. So I'm going to run through about 15 or so books here of his that I've read and why I think that you maybe should read those. And let's start with the Andromeda Strain. Like I said, it's my very first science fiction book. And many claim it created the techno thriller as well as popularized the whole deadly plague subgenre. This was 1969. A lot of people think that Stephen King or Robert McCann kind of created that subgenre, but obviously it was here long before that. It was probably there long before Michael Crichton, but that's just kind of more how. I'm not that old, guys. I can't go that far back and dig up everything that's been dealt with in a plague or whatever. But this was my introduction to that subgenre. But I found it on my brother's bookshelf, like I said, as a preteen, and I had only read fantasy up to this point, so it completely took me for a loop. This was years before I read Dune or anything like that. So his understanding of science and microbiology kind of made it terrifyingly real to me as a young man. And the spread of disease in this and how it affects humanity really just makes this fringe horror, really. So you think about this was what really broke this guy out. And yeah, it's pretty damn scary. Next up, we have The Terminal Man. And this one was something that I think that also has kind of gotten popularized much more successfully later. And it's about experimenting with planting electrodes into the human brain and the brain's pleasure centers, and things go predictably wrong, and it basically creates a psychopath that's way too smart for everybody. And it's a quick adrenaline rush of a read. I think you can read it in a couple of sittings. Like I said, that was one of those in high school I checked out like on a Monday, and by Wednesday I was up looking for the next book, which was The Great Train Robbery. Because like I did with Stephen King, if they had everything, it's like I read that first book and then I went back and I read everything in publication order. And so that's why I'm kind of going through it in publication order. And The Great Train Robbery, this is probably where I first learned the term page turner, because it is that. I don't think this one, would you call this one a techno thriller at all, really. Every chapter kind of left me with the I have to see what happens next kind of feeling, where you just couldn't stop. But I mean, it's just a classic heist story. It's based off of a real gold robbery that took place in the 1850s, I believe. And it's the Victorian London. Highlights how the railroad system kind of changed everything for Europe during that time period. It's just fun, enthusiastic read. It doesn't require you to think as hard as some of his more scientific books might. And another one I think you could read really, really quick. I think there's a reason they sell those first three books in a collection of Andromeda Strain, Terminal Man, and Great Train Robbery. Because Andromeda Strain, that requires some thought and whatever. But I feel like Terminal Man and Great Train Robbery, you could probably read those in a weekend. Not that big of a deal, but just fun. Good times. It's a lot. I think it's a lot before he became more cynical towards humanity, So it wasn't as much thoughts about this is why we're screwing everything up. This is why we're in trouble. None of that here. It's just, like I said, it's when he was youthful and he was having a good time, I think. As with the next one, Eaters of the Dead. Now, you guys, I've talked about his movies or whatnot, and you might know this might be more familiar to you knowing it as The 13th Warrior. That was what they called the movie version with Antonio Banderas. And in my opinion, it's one of the less painful movie adaptations of his work. Had a good time with it. Books, obviously, is always going to be better. But this was writing something that felt like fantasy horror. I mean, I know it was based off of historical figures in historical times, but to me, it kind of felt like fantasy horror because it has some of the creepiest villains that he ever wrote. And it's about a Muslim man traveling with a group of Danes to their Viking settlement in the 10th century. And but during this time, they're hunted by a tribe of savages called the Wendell. And these are just bloodthirsty, like mist creatures, it seems like, whatever, which I'm sure is just kind of a thing. It's kind of told from a different narrator, so you got the whole unreliable narrator aspect, and some of them saying like, we understand that some of these things have been passed down through the centuries, they might not be accurate, so they describe these creatures as almost like mist creatures, shadow creatures, or whatnot. But obviously, when you're scared for your life, you might be seeing some things, right? It's really good. It's a really good idea, kind of in a Bram Stoker kind of way, where it's like the secondhand accounts of what happened during this time. So I thought it was an interesting format for him to use. But it was really before I had seen anything like that before. Basically, you say it's like a found footage version of a book or whatnot. So really neat idea. And like I said, if you like how Bram Stoker's Dracula's format's set up, you'll probably have a good time with that one. So it's got your history, and it's got your horror, and it's got your, well, I'll just leave it there. Congo. Now, this is one I can't tell you. This is probably one of the first times a non-Stephen King movie just had me fuming angry in the theater, because I can't tell you how bad that shit show and adaptation they made in the mid-1990s. Dude, you had an amazing book, and you had an amazing actor in Tim Curry, and that's what you shit out? Seriously? I couldn't believe how bad that movie. I was sitting in the theaters like, why are they turning this into a sci-fi romp movie? I don't even understand. But the book is almost like an Indiana Jones story, but you got scientists instead of a scientist with huge laptops instead of archaeologists with whips or whatnot. So this had all the fun stuff from one of those adventures, up to and including volcanoes and cannibals and things like that. But many might find it kind of campy, since it does deal with lost cities and treasures and diamonds in the Congo, as well as, gorillas that are using sign language to communicate or whatnot. But I mean, I just had a blast with it. It's a really neat idea, I thought. And again, what I liked mostly about Michael Crichton is he was writing stuff like this that I don't know how he ever came up with the ideas for this, and no one else was writing anything like this. Even King wasn't writing stuff this off the wall. And I mean that in the highest compliment possible. Then you have Sphere. Sphere, I think, is one of the first books that ever melted my mind. It just, oh my God, this is about 2 years before Dune for me here, and this was the first book that really just made me like question everything on a philosophical level. I mean, nothing did that for me like Sphere did. And I mean, we're talking about hive minds and quantum physics and relativity with black holes and what the human mind is capable of and how we only use like a small percentage of it and stuff like that. It's just, man, it just starts off as just your basic exploring a crashed alien vessel, and it just evolves into so much more. This is one I think I would love to reread at this age and see if it felt the same way about it as I did then, because at the time I was like 15 years old, and I just, wow. It just, so many things. I can't get into it without spoiling you, but God, just trust me. Don't watch that garbage movie version. Read this book, and man, I want to know how it's aged, really. I really would like to see how it's aged. If I didn't have such a busy TBR, I would definitely be rereading some of these, because just thinking about these for this episode, I think about so many things that I thought then. I'd like to see if I still feel the same way now. But Sphere, man. Oh my God, just so many themes that you couldn't get enough of, like us being our own worst enemy and sowing our own seeds for destruction. Oh, so good. That's a top fiver for me for Crichton. Jurassic Park, do I even need to explain this one? I think this was at the time where it felt like only our parents were reading Michael Crichton, but we got to see what this is all about, because we saw the movie and we love the movie, right? Look, this is the book that launched Crichton to the mainstream, all right? I think even he would acknowledge that. You couldn't go to any bookstore in the 90s without seeing this book everywhere. And believe it or not, it was pretty popular even before the movie came out. I mean, there's a reason that Spielberg wanted to make this movie, right? But in fact, apparently the story is that he had to outbid James Cameron for it, and James Cameron wanted to make it more of a horror story, kind of like the book is. So, and that makes you always wonder, dude, I love that movie. Don't misunderstand me, but the book blows it away on every level, and it's really quite different. It's a lot more scary than the movie was. Obviously, it was a Hollywood blockbuster family movie, and again, I feel like it's one of those things like The Shining with Stephen King, where both versions are great. Both versions really are great. So don't misunderstand me here. But what I enjoyed about the book, because I think everyone knows the plot by now, was the focus on things like dystopian possibilities from meddling in science that we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be playing God or whatnot. But one of the criticism that Crichton always got was that his stories, off the charts, amazing, but that his characters were forgettable or they weren't relatable or whatever. And I think that with Ian Malcolm, he made probably the best character he had ever made because he has someone that could explain the math, the science to us without it becoming Star Trek technobabble. He could put it on a calm and cool way. I mean, it was the first time that he made like a scientist cool in one of his books, whatever. And I could see that's why the way they went with Jeff Goldblum in the movie. I get that. But you didn't have to have a PhD in rocket science to understand what was going on here. And in a book that dealt with DNA strands and stuff like that was just blowing people away at that time, perfect character. It's still probably my favorite character he's ever had in one of his books. Also, the book is just so much darker. And like I said, based on horror, me being a horror guy, obviously, the movies don't dare to go that way. And look, I enjoy the new movies with Chris Pratt, with my kids and whatnot. But I mean, I'm glad Mr. Crichton's not around to see it, honestly, because I don't think he would, that or Westworld, he would not be having a good time with either of those. So let's move on to Rising Sun. If you had enough of the sci-fi stuff, how about a modern day in 1992, detective corporate espionage story that deals with uneasy Japanese-American relations, right? Okay, yeah. What Crichton does so good here is just show you how far the gap is in the difference between Japanese culture and Western mindsets. I think it just showed us how different of a world it was. It really, for me, it was my first dose of anything like that. And I always wondered reading this, is this what Tom Clancy novels are like? Because if so, never read a Tom Clancy novel. Still, whatever. I've seen some of the Jack Ryan movies because I loved Harrison Ford. That is the same author, right? Is Tom Clancy that does Jack Ryan? Anyway, when I was reading, I wondered if that's what his books were like. Because if so, I probably would like them quite a bit. But I still never read any of them. So, drop in the comments and tell me why I should read Tom Clancy, right? I scratch your back, you scratch mine, right? Disclosure. This was the first Crichton novel that I bought on hardcover the day that it came out. And what a start it was, because this is a fantastic book. And I cannot imagine if this book came out today in this current political climate, this time of identity politics, because Crichton would be canceled on Goodreads, basically. The idea that sexual harassment did not know a gender, but that power was determined, basically, sorry, what I mean is harassment was determined by power. And that was the thing. Gender didn't matter, whatnot. Basically, it was a wild concept at the time. I'm trying to choose my words nicely, politely here, not getting any reports on this video or whatnot. But this book is so much more than that. You think about the movie with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, and they basically made it all about that. But it was a ton more in that. It dealt with, pulling back the curtain on the cutthroats, dog-eat-dog world of corporate business in America, lawsuits, just basically wrongful lawsuits. And he predicted the American housing market collapse in this book, I think. And advances in technology. I already talked about the e-reader thing. He reversed gender roles before it was cool, right? And I know that people don't like it when it goes the other way. They like it when it goes, this way, but they don't like it when it goes that way. And Crichton wasn't scared. He did what I think that no one thought that this kind of role was possible at the time. And to do this in the mid-90s, got to tip your hat to him. You really, really do. But there was a really funny review I read of this recently, and I wanted to bring this quote up because I talk about how many things Crichton got right. This is from the New York Times review in 1994. It says, Mr. Crichton irrelevantly entertains us with a complex vision of a digital future, complete with cellular phones the size of credit cards. That's never going to happen. CD-ROM players that can store 600 books, and database environments you can virtually walk around in with the guidance of a helpful angel who cracks wise. I don't know about you guys, but Siri makes jokes at me all the time. Again, Crichton was not afraid to take chances and things that probably could make his books seem kind of aged. To me, the only thing that makes his books feel aged is no one's using smartphones. That's about the only thing. I'm sorry, smartphones. They don't actually use them for phones. They use them for this, right? But again, very forward thinking, and I think that Disclosure's gotten a rep as just a anti-feminist book, and I don't think that's what it is at all. Read it and make up your own mind. Don't take that movie as any reason to form an opinion about it. I'm just saying the way that I see people get canceled these days for much lesser things, I'm glad Mr. Crichton did this 20 years ago. Airframe. This is where it kind of started to turn for me. This is where I began to question if Crichton had lost his mojo or not. It was a knee deep in his time during ER. And this book felt like I was reading a Warren Commission report or something. It was about a plane crash investigation, and it just felt like I was reading the investigation of a plane crash, like reading the data from a black box or something. And I don't know if it's because he was so involved with ER at the time or just his star was rising so high. It just felt like he was distracted. That's how I felt. And I wonder if maybe this one would be more interesting to me now. You know, in 1996, what was I? 17, 18, 16. So math is hard on the fly. I might not have been into that, and I might be more into it now. That's just what I remember. But I remember being like, that's it when I finished reading it in high school. So I don't really have a ton more to offer on that one. I know a lot of people continually have it like in their top 5 Crichton novels. So maybe it was a me thing. Maybe I just wasn't ready for that. So much like I did with my Stephen King reread, where a lot of books that I read when I was 15 and other ones I read when I was like 35 or 38, it was different. It was different. So I'd like to actually revisit that one in the future and see if I feel the same way about it. My concerns that he had lost his mojo were thrown out the window in 1999 when Timeline came out. This one is divisive among Crichton fans. I absolutely love it. It's in the conversation for my favorite Michael Crichton book of all time, because before I read this, I'd always looked at time travel through the Back to the Future style rules, where you could be able to go back and change things in a timeline, and the timeline adjusts to those changes. This book warped every thought about time travel in the best ways, and I won't get into too many details because I'd like you to read this, but also someone who's really big into medieval fantasy and historical fiction at the time. This dealt with basically modern day characters going back in time to the 1300s France. And I know, like I said, fans are kind of divided on this one, but man, I love it. It is easily one of my favorite time travel stories ever, right up there with H.G. Wells' Time Machine. It just presented so many ideas for stuff I feel like has been kind of, aped recently. Ever heard of Outlander? That just deals with time travel. That's really wrong of me to say. But basically, imagine Doctor Who if it was dead ass serious. That's kind of how I felt about this when I first read it, because you got your professor, you got your younger kids, and it's man, I can't say too much, but man, I can't talk enough about that book. I might actually do an exclusive review just about timeline so I can get into the ideas, because man, the science might seem a little dense to some people in there, but good lord, is it so good. So much just changed the way that I thought about time travel forever. Prey. I had never even heard of nanotech before this book came out in the early 2000s. And if you take away smartphones, I feel like this one could probably still hold up today, because the swarm in this is just downright terrifying. Because when I read it, I learned that this was based on real technology, and that terrified me, right? I never looked at E. coli the same way again, let's put it that way. But another good Crichton story about meddling with science that we don't understand yet, and the idea of it having serious consequences, especially if that technology becomes self-aware and starts to think for itself. I think that game Horizon Zero Dawn, this might just be me. Horizon Zero Dawn, PlayStation 4. I feel like it took a lot of story ideas from this. That might just be me, but I feel like it got a lot of ideas from that. State of Fear. Crichton was outspoken on climate change. I know that's a real big one, a hot button issue for people these days. But while he thought it was a very real thing, he did not believe it was a man-made problem, and he refuted scientific and economic assertions of global warming activists or alarmists, and he pointed out that the real motivation was just the pursuit of money, because there's a huge amount of money to be made off of scaring the shit out of people, right? And he blasts the media in this and the way that they fearmonger, and I think that's why this book wasn't received as well by modern day audiences, because he's flat out like, the planet's not in trouble, we're in trouble. We can save us, we can't save the planet. The planet don't even care about us. We're just going to be a flash in its life cycle. We'll be over and out before it even notices that we're here. And those are the kind of ideas that really just got me to thinking or whatnot. So your views on climate change aside, I don't think that's going to affect if you like this book or not. I'm just saying he does have his opinions about it. And to me, the idea of the 24-hour news cycle just being there to scare the shit out of us and get ratings, I think that's blatantly obvious that he was ahead of the curve once again on these things. So I think that's why this one recently has started to get a big thumbs down from people. But at the time, man, like I said, this guy wasn't scared to say any of these things, and it really opened my eyes to it. Next, if I had known this was going to be the last book we got while he was still alive, I probably would have felt better about it. At the time, and I've only just read it once, I was lukewarm on it because I felt like the ideas had been done previously in other books, and they had been done much better. And his books, by the way. I just felt like it was a mashup of previous novels dealing with, altering genetics and corporate greed, etc. But in truth, I feel like this one was kind of a victim of his previous work. He had set the bar so high at this point. How could he really top himself? What could he do that he hadn't done already? But I mean, as a standalone, not compared to a previous body of work, I think it probably would have been fine. But I mean, I forgot about it really about a day or two after reading it, and I never feel that way about his books. So that's why I think it's I kind of felt that way about it. But when I read, I mean, when the tweet came up, I was really big on Twitter then, more so than now. When the tweet came up in 2008 that he had passed away, I thought it was a joke, or a hoax. Not really a joke, a hoax. There were so many fake death hoaxes and stuff like that. So I didn't even know the man was sick. But, obviously he was very private. He wasn't really like out there in the public eye about, hey, I'm fighting cancer right now. So it was just such a shock to me that when Pirate Latitudes came out, I bought it without question because I thought this could be the last thing by Michael Crichton that I ever read. And posthumously released stuff, I'm always kind of leery about how much is actually the author. But apparently this manuscript was discovered on his computer after his death. And some people said he had been working on this since the 70s. In the 70s, he did have an interview where he said he was working on a pirate story. So I don't know how much of it was actually him, but I'll just say that it felt like a much better goodbye to him than Next was. And much better send-off, I think. But it's 17th century swashbuckling story about raiding the Spanish for their booty, right? And it's a real Treasure Island prequel vibe kind of feels what I had to it. And like I said, it was fine. It would have been fine if it had been the very last book that I would have talked about for him. But there was one more. I didn't read Micro when it came out because it was like completed by somebody else, and I was like, I have no interest in that. I lived through Brian Herbert bastardizing Dune. I didn't need anybody bastardizing Crichton's work, so I still haven't read Micro. So if you have thoughts about Micro, go ahead and let me know. But Dragon Teeth, this was the last one that I read by him. This one was also written in the 1970s. It deals with the Bone Wars. If you know the Bone Wars in the 1870s, where there was competition for finding dinosaur fossils. It was basically the coolest thing since the gold rush 20 years earlier or whatnot. But a lot of people kind of call it the spiritual successor to Jurassic Park. But I'm like, just because it's Michael Crichton and deals with dinosaurs. But it had all the things we loved about Crichton. It had even without the whole techno thriller vibe, it had the plot twist. It had the suspense. And it was, if that had been the last Crichton story I read, as it has been, I'm fine with it because I had no intentions of reading the Andromeda Strain sequel. I know people saying, "Oh yeah, it's mostly his work." I'm just skeptical on that. I mean, this is starting to get like Tupac levels here. How much stuff did he have ready to go that we didn't know about? And apparently it's just because he didn't encrypt his computers why we even have this stuff or whatnot. But in the end, guys, I couldn't really do a short version of this video because this is an author I love every bit as much as I love Stephen King. And you see my Stephen King collection up there. You know how big of a fan I am. But him and Crichton were my high school years. This was everything. I mean, everybody else was going off and buying their albums and going to keggers and stuff, and I was reading books. And I think about the fact that I had to make the decision a couple times in high school. Do I want to actually take my biology book, which was this thick, or do I want to take that new Crichton book with me? I think I'll take the Crichton book or whatnot. So that's kind of how it was for me. But it was all I read with a little bit of Dune and Lord of the Rings and rereads in high school. It's pretty much all I did. But his death just completely caught me off guard in 2008, as I think it did everyone. And it just kind of still doesn't feel real. It still does. I keep expecting to see like that new Michael Crichton thriller come out, written by him and not by someone else or posted posthumously. But in the end, I mean, why should you read Michael Crichton? Well, because the man not only could write a ripping good yarn, as I like to say, but it leaves you thinking about things. You have thoughts in your head after you're done. It's not anything that you forget about 5 minutes after you finish reading. And like I said, his stories stayed with you, and I'd like to see them not get lost to future generations, like we're seeing a lot right now. We're seeing a bit of a generation gap there, and I think it's if you don't share things that you love with your kids, how are they going to learn about it if they don't have the interest to learn on their own? So that's why a lot of the things that I'm into, I try to share with my kids. And you know what? It's up to them if they like it or not, obviously. But yeah, that's just kind of where I am with it. That's why I think you should read it. You'll be left questioning a great many things after you finish one of his books. So guys, have you read Michael Crichton? Do you want to? Do you know where to start? Drop in the comments, guys. Drop in below. Let me know your thoughts on the polymath that was Michael Crichton. If you still need a little idea of a certain book that you might like, ask me the question. I'll have no problem talking to you about Michael Crichton. I can talk about Michael Crichton all day, as you've seen here or whatnot. But that was Michael Crichton, guys. I will talk to you in the comments.